Good morning, everybody. If you could please take your seats. So good morning and welcome. My name's Andrew Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. I'll refer to us as SSI from here on because it's much easier to go through. Firstly, housekeeping. There are no planned fire drills this morning, but should the alarms go, please follow the signs as orderly and urgent as you can, as marked as the exits, mainly where you came through the door into here. We have Wi-Fi codes posted on the pillars, which will be useful because we will be using Slido for yourselves to participate with the panel, where you can post questions, etc., and they will appear on the screen so you can see and you can vote on those. That'll be explained in a little bit more detail, but important to set yourselves up on the Wi-Fi if you don't have any other connection. So thank you for joining us. We're really pleased you're here. We are working with the question, which we're going to explore today, together with yourselves. What is the role of sustainable biofuels in shipping's decarbonisation? First of all, who is the SSI? Well, we are a member-led NGO. We're made up of 15 members who are spanning the entire value chain. So we have members from ship owners, charterers, classification societies, banks, NGOs joining us as well, and also maritime equipment and service providers. So we are a small cohort, and we're very action-focused and thought leadership-focused, and have a long-term vision, which is why you see 2040 on our URL for a vision and a roadmap to 2040, which we're in the process of updating shortly. So as part of our decarbonisation focus, we're focused on all decarbonisation alternatives, but why biofuels for this discussion? So a little background, generally transport accounts for 14% of global GHG emissions, of which shipping accounts for 2 to 3% of those. We see an urgent need for decarbonisation in shipping. Time is critical, and we are focused on, of course, meeting the commitments of the Paris Agreement. It's a must-do for shipping in terms of decarbonisation, and as I mentioned, time is critical considering the life cycle of vessels, with many vessels being in operation 20 plus years. So the need for zero-emission vessels to be entering on a commercially viable basis and low or zero carbon vessels by 2030 is essential for shipping to meet its 2050 targets. There is no silver bullet in terms of the alternative fuels that have been raised and identified, and many of you know the discussions around these. This emerged from a report that the SSI commissioned with Lloyd's Register and UMass in early 2018. We published this report in May. You can find it on our website, and the report is titled Zero Emission Vessels, What Needs to be Done? From the findings of the research in the report, the SSI have decided to take a deeper dive into the role of biofuels and what role can biofuels play in the decarbonisation of the industry. In particular, given the wider system issues and the potential for competing sectors in terms of the available resource. Through 2019, the SSI, together with one of its members, Forum for the Future, have been taking and leading the convening of a multi-stakeholder debate and discussion into the possible role of biofuels in the industry's decarbonisation. And as I mentioned, this is to better understand those wider system issues. So we have engaged with academia, IGOs, NGOs, and industry earlier in seminars during the year. We've had 2 in-person seminars at the end of June, beginning of July, and a webinar. And this event today is the last in the series of engagements together with yourselves to hear your views together with our esteemed panel of experienced leaders from industry, government and sustainability, and engage with us and help us follow up on our research into those wider system issues and contribute to a report that we will publish with the support of Forum for the Future on November the 15th. And we will do that, and I'll read this out so I get the title correct, at the 6th intersessional meeting of the Working Group on Reduction of GHG Emissions from Ships at the International Maritime Organization in London. So again, the published date will be November the 15th, where we will bring all of our findings from the work done so far this year together. It's important that I stress that, please note that SSI does not have a position on biofuels, and we will not either. The SSI is technology and fuel agnostic in this regard, and as we see it, biofuels may end up as one of many alternatives used and part of a wider solution for shipping going forwards in its goal to decarbonise. What is clear is that we need to work through the issues, which you're going to help us a little with today as well, and we need to move from the debate as an industry into action. That's very clear. Time is running fast. The SSI supports the maritime industry's transitions to zero-emission shipping by 2050, and we will work collaboratively with many stakeholders on the how. Collaboration is key, and shipping is not going to solve this alone, so we've been engaging with other sectors, aviation amongst them. Your engagement with us is essential in this endeavour, and I will now like to hand over to Sally Uren, who is the CEO of Forum for the Future, who will be moderating this event this morning. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. Morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say, I know you're probably really happy at the back there, but if you do want to come forward, then please join us. But as we get people to come in, Nicole, maybe we can encourage them to come to the front, because you see very far away. As Andrew said, my name is Sally Uren, and it's my job this morning to take you through the event and really hopefully get some insights into this big question that's behind me. And Forum for the Future, for those of you that don't know us, we're a sustainable development non-profit. We try and work to accelerate progress towards sustainable development, and we do that by pulling together collaborations to solve complex sustainability challenges, and to do that taking a systems approach. So we're very interested in this notion of systems change as a way of accelerating progress towards the SDGs. And it's through our role as a convener and collaborator, it's been a real pleasure to work with the SSI, thank you for shortening it, Andrew, in this project that actually this is part of. So today is not just an event, it is an input into an ongoing inquiry to look at the potential for biofuels in shipping. So all of your input here today will be incredibly valuable because it will feed directly into the report to be announced at the very complicated sounded event that is happening in November. In terms of the format for today, it's pretty predictable, except that what I hope won't be predictable will be the insights, because we have a fabulous panel who I will introduce in a moment. And we want to make this interactive, so we've enlisted the help of technology. And if we can have the slide that will just introduce Slido, if you wouldn't mind. Well, if we come back to the panelists in a moment, but let's just get Slido up and running. There we go. So what we'd like to do is to invite you to pose any questions that might come to mind as the panelists are talking, and pose them on Slido. So you literally just need to go to slido.com, that's your hashtag there, and what we'll do is to try and pose the questions that seem to be most popular. So you'll be able to vote for the questions that you like, and so on and so forth. If none of that works, we'll just go back to the old-fashioned way and I'll just ask you. But this is a way of trying to kind of get a bit more democracy into the process and get a sense of which of the questions are really pressing. And just to give you a moment to get onto Slido, because to check that this works, and also to get a sense of the views in the room, we do have a question that we'd like to pose to get us in the mood. So I think you've got a minute, Will? Okay, so on a scale from 1 to 5, how supportive are you regarding the use of biofuels in shipping? Okay, so fairly strong support. No one's quite brave enough to say not at all. I imagine if that was your answer, you're in the wrong place. Interesting. Okay, great. Well, that gives us context for the views in the room, and this is at the heart of the question that we'll be exploring today. The specific purpose of today is to really try and do three things. We want to understand the risks and the opportunities that decarbonisation in shipping presents. Secondly, to look at the potential role of biofuels within that decarbonisation. But thirdly, to understand what is that route for decarbonisation that shipping might take? What are the policy drivers, the other enablers within the system that we need to be mindful of in order to deliver that decarbonisation? Great, okay. So Slido works, thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do without further ado is introduce our brilliant panellists. And as I call your name, if you wouldn't mind coming up in the specific order, because we have a flow of narrative here that we'd like to keep to. So if first of all I could just ask Manuel to come up, and if we could have the slide with the panellists back on the screen, that would be great. Thank you. Manuel, please take a seat.
Thank you.
And then Gerard O Timer, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Thank you very much. Then Keirsey Taki, please. And then Christine Weydig from the Port Authority of New York. Adair Turner, Lord Adair Turner, I believe, from the Energy Transitions Commission. And then, by no means last, but at no means least, John from MESC, who one of the founders of this SSI, that's a designated nature reserve, the SSI, back. When did the SSI start? 2010. Thank you, Andrew. Great. So, what I would like you all to do in turn is to introduce yourselves, but tell us your name, your organisation. But what I'm really interested in is your interest in decarbonisation of shipping and interest in the potential for biofuels.
Sure,
Manuel.
Sally, thank you. Thank you very much. I look very informal in that picture. I was in Fiji, that is why the shirt. So, can you hear me? It's working? I don't think so.
Can you hear Manuel at the back?
No, probably, yeah, now it's working.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. So yes, I am Manuel Puig Vidal, currently working with WWF International in charge of the climate and energy practice. Used to be Minister of the Environment of Peru and President of the climate conference, COP20 in 2014. So, why this is important? First, because we are trying to build a collective vision toward decarbonization. We do know, and that is why this summit, that we must move the world toward a net zero time and a 1.5 trajectory. So that is the first thing. The second one, it is to do that, and some of you went to this exponential roadmap presentation some days ago. We have to scale up technologies. And it is important, technologies, policies, and mobilization. Those are the three main elements when we think about the 2050. Third, let's think you were a country. The shipping, it is as Germany, 2 to 3%. But nobody has included in their own NDC the target of the shipping sector because it is an international sector. What should we do in relation to the shipping sector? That is why the importance of this event. Fourth, because we are talking about long-term strategy. And fifth and sixth. Fifth, because the shipping sector, it is one of the hard-to-abate sectors. We are in a time in which we are working with the shipping, aviation, cement, and steel. Those are the hard-to-abate sectors. And in this time in which we want to secure a strong 2020, 2030, and 2050, we must address it. And the last one, it is because the relation of this discussion with science. Yesterday or today, it has been just released the Oceans and the Cryosphere report, that it is talking about the systemic impacts that we are producing to the oceans, the melting, sea level rise, vulnerable countries, and acidification, among some others. So what it would be the future of the ports when we talk about sea level rise, no? So those are the reasons, Sally, that for me it is really, really important to have this discussion.
Thank you very much, and we're very happy you could make it, Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gerard, if you wouldn't mind doing the same.
Thank you very much. My name is Gerard Ostheimer. I'm the co-founder and managing director of a global campaign called Below 50. As the name implies, we're trying to promote fuels that have emissions reductions by greater than 50%. This is done in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But we're different in that we don't want to be a supplier group. There's a lot of supplier groups out there in the world. We actually want to be a demand group. We want to aggregate demand. And because what's going to drive shipping is all of the people who are paying for the cargo to be transported. All of those people need to come together, need to understand that their voice can actually influence fuel purchasing decisions. And then my perspective of one is that there is a potential for biofuels to participate, but we are very far away from biofuels having a meaningful impact. And so the question is less for me, can biofuels do this, but how would biofuels do this? And how can we accelerate that so that we take advantage of the advantages of biofuels, the benefits they can provide in terms of greenhouse gas sequestration in the land, benefits they can provide in terms of rural development, SDG 15, and looking around the world at examples of policy that can facilitate the responsible uptake. And there are some bright spots that I will allude to later. Thank you, Sally.
Great, thank you very much. Kirsi.
Thank you, Sally. My name is Keirsey Taki, and my background is technical, and I've spent all my career in shipping. I'm in a transition period. I have just recently joined a couple of shipping company boards, and prior to that, I worked almost 20 years with American Bureau of Shipping in various roles. I've been involved in environmental issues in shipping all my career, starting from oil pollution prevention to ballast water management and air emission regulations. And all these regulations have been very challenging for shipping, but their impact really fades in comparison to the decarbonisation and the ambition to get to zero or net zero shipping. International shipping carries approximately 90% of world goods, and it is the most efficient mode of transportation in terms of CO2 emissions per cargo transport. And the world economy really depends on seaborne transportation. However, with the current forecast for growth in trade and seaborne transportation, if we continue within the current framework, regulatory framework as well energy efficiency framework, there will be a significant increase in the CO2 emissions, and therefore we need to take an action. The IMO preliminary targets for CO2 reduction is 40% density reduction by 2030, and 50% total greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. These ambitions are achievable. However, they will require a lot of resources to get there. And to get started soon, quickly, we need to look at things that are available today, such as biofuels, such as operational measures, which I'll talk about later. My personal ambition really is to use my knowledge and experience in shipping to help to set the course for the future and as soon as possible.
Great, well, we're lucky to have you here to share that set of insights. Thank you very much. Christine.
So Christine Weydig, I'm the director of the Office of Environmental and Energy Programs for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And for those of you that aren't from the area, a little bit about my organization. We operate 5 airports, 8 seaports, 6 bridges and tunnels, a PATH subway system, a small subway system that connects New York and New Jersey. We have the busiest bus terminal in the United States. We have another transportation hub in New Jersey. And we also own and operate the World Trade Center site and a few other large real estate holdings in the New York, New Jersey area. We have some ambitious climate action goals. We have an 80 by 50 reduction goal that we've had for about a decade. But then last October, our board embraced the Paris Climate Agreement, and we set an interim greenhouse gas reduction target of 35 by 25. Now, these targets require that we not only reduce our direct emissions, but that we work with our partners to reduce all of the emissions arising from our operations. So that includes aircraft-related emissions, it includes emissions related to ocean-going vessels, even to the trucks that bring cargo to and from our ports. So it's a really big commitment, and we really need to partner with a lot of others in order to achieve those. But at the same time that we operate all of this major transportation infrastructure, we also are part of our mission is to support local economic development, regional economic development. So we've made huge investments in increasing our port-related activity. Right now, we're the second busiest port in the US. We just recently beat out the Port of Long Beach, and I think we're eager to hold on to that edge. But we've invested a lot of money in facilitating the growth of our port business. So we raised one of our bridges, the Bayonne Bridge. We raised the roadway so that we can accommodate post-Panamax vessels at our ports. We've embarked on a number of harbor deepening efforts, in addition to just improving some of the other infrastructure at our ports. So at the same time as we're committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're also committed to improving the economic development that's related to goods movement in the region. We're trying to make that more efficient. We've invested heavily in intermodal rail facilities at the ports so that we can take advantage of lower carbon ways to move goods once they're at port. But all of that said, there really is a lot of work to be done in terms of decreasing the greenhouse gas emissions related to the vessels that call on the port. We have certain incentives in place. We have clean vessel incentives to have some of the ships use operational practices like slow steaming and others that can reduce some of the emissions when they come into our port facilities. But we're really here as part of a broader stakeholder engagement process. We do, similar stakeholder engagement on our aviation business. But as it relates to the role of biofuels have applications in a number of our business areas. And so part of what the perspective that we represent is how do we ensure that biofuels or technologies, alternative fuel technologies, are really placed in the sectors where they would have the most impact, and make sure that they're not perpetuating some of the combustion of fuels that in other sectors that are more where there are technologies more readily available to really move them to a zero emission state.
Great, thank you. So you are in a brilliant position to both help us navigate the conversation between the tensions of economic growth and the need for rapid decarbonisation. But as the Port Authority, you've got a purview over both maritime and aviation sectors. So we'll come back to that particular intersection in a moment. Adair, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, please.
Yeah, I'm Adair Turner. I chair or co-chair something called the Energy Transitions Commission, which is a global coalition of both companies, large and small, from many sectors, and NGOs. So we have Shell, we have BP in membership, we have Huaneng Group. You may not have heard of them, but they have more electricity generating capacity than France and Britain combined. They're the second biggest electricity generator in China. We have Tata from India. We have cement companies, ArcelorMittal, the biggest steel company in the world. You can look at our website and see the reach. We also have Rocky Mountain Institute, World Resources Institute. This coalition came together 4 years ago in the belief that we have to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, well below 2 degrees, and indeed following the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC last autumn, we have accepted that as the objective. And we believe that if we're serious about 1.5 degrees, then the global economy has to get to net zero by about mid-century, and we would say the developed world by 2050. Maybe some of the emerging markets can take another 10 years to get there. We originally focused in our first year of work on the electricity sector, and we illustrated, I think, what an increasing number of people are accepting, that the wonderful news is we can now go further and faster and cheaper to the decarbonisation of electricity than any of us dared dream 10 years ago. But having done that, we thought we would then focus on what people sometimes call the hard-to-abate sectors, sectors which are often ignored in many plans for global decarbonisation, and in particular in national determined contributions under the Paris process. Those sectors are heavy industrial sectors like steel, cement, and petrochemicals, and they are the long-distance transport sectors like shipping, aviation, and trucking. We did a 2-year project to look at those, and we produced a report in December last year, and the answer says on the title, we believe it is mission possible to get every one of those not to a 50% reduction, and I was challenging the Secretary General of the IMO just Monday morning here, not to a 50% reduction, but to a 100% reduction to net zero by 2050. And by the way, we mean zero means zero. Not that one's getting to zero because one is buying offsets from another sector of the economy, because when you think about it, if every sector of the economy has to be at zero, there's nobody to buy offsets from. So I think we've got to be serious about what 1.5 means. It means getting to zero. We mean that believe it is absolutely technologically possible in all of these sectors of the economy to get to zero by 2050. Some of them may require a bit of carbon capture and storage. That's why the term net is in there. It's not offsets, it's a bit of carbon capture and storage. We believe we can all get there by 2050. Part of our work as a commission is then to look across all of those sectors and work out what does that mean for the total amount of biofuels, because it's all very well if sector one, cement, says, well, I'm going to put biomass into my cement kiln, and the aviation sector says, well, I'd like some biomass for biofuels, and the shipping sector says the same. We've been trying to work out, does it all work across the whole of these sectors in terms of the supply of electricity that would be required, or the supply of hydrogen that would be required, or the supply of sustainable biomass. So within that context, I'll finish there, and I'll talk on my next question about what we specifically believe on shipping. But the background is, we believe the target should be zero, and we're very interested in the issue about these relative priorities across different sectors and how we make the total answer balance up.
Great. So there you have it, a spoiler alert. We're going to get some more insights into that question in a moment. Thank you, Adair. John, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves.
Good morning, everybody. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Good morning, everybody. My name is JohnConnell Bang, and I'm Chief Advisor on Climate Change for Maersk, global container and logistics company. We operate 700 plus container vessels and therefore have CO2 equivalent emissions in the vicinity of 40 million tons a year. So it's a quite heavy operation from that point of view. Last year we announced a target of becoming net zero by 2050, so we listened to the ETC because we believe it's necessary for shipping to continue to stay relevant as a servant of global trade. The climate crisis is real. The climate crisis requires to go to zero, and we have seen after 10 years of leadership in efficiency improvement on the current technologies that we have on ships, that we have improved our efficiency by 41% by the end of last year. We have a plan that's really built on known things that we know we can implement to reach 60% efficiency improvement in 2030, and yet our absolute emission curve is completely flat. So it's of course good with the efficiency, it absorbs our growth, it's better than nothing, but obviously it does not set us on a pathway to decarbonization at all. It's just a flat curve. So therefore I think we can, with some legitimacy, say that we know that in order to decarbonize shipping, we need to completely revolutionize the propulsion technologies and the fuels. The 0 point is 250. it's far away, but it's not far away because we have, of course, the asset cycles of 20-25 years. So we need the first commercially viable vessels that are net zero on the waters in service in our network. So I'm not talking about a pilot. I'm talking about vessels that goes in to our commercial network and services the trade that we service by 2030. And that's only 11 years from now. And so we need to accelerate the identification and the scaling of solutions, which is also part of the reason why we made this announcement in this moonshot type of style, because that's what it really is. We do not have a plan. We don't know how to get there in 2030. The only thing we do know, that on the contrary to the efficiency work, we cannot do it alone at all. So we need the energy companies, oil companies, we need the engine manufacturers and so on and so forth to come together and help us achieve this. And interest in biofuel, obviously biofuel is one of the possible pathways. A solution in the end, a transition solution. What kind of transition solution? We don't know. We are still in a very open mindset looking at all of the pathways that are on the table. We are, of course, afraid of over-investing in the wrong pathway. So we need to be prudent here. But that's why we also need the collaboration to achieve some degree of risk sharing, really. But that goes for all actors. And I'll stop here, but there's more to say about this, of course.
Great. Thank you very much. What a brilliant set of perspectives we have up here, representing different aspects of the system that needs to come together to design for the decarbonisation that we know is necessary. And John, I love organisations that have moonshot goals, because actually that's what we really need. And I think if we aim for the moon, then we're going to cross some mountains along the way, and that's better than just being on a flat pathway. Can I just get a sense of who all is in the room? So put your hand up if you're involved directly with the maritime sector as an operator, shipbuilder. Okay. So a good proportion involved directly. And then in terms of kind of the other split of the audience, who here is from the private sector? Okay, almost half. Who is from non-profit sector? Oh, quite a few. And then the public sector. Brilliant, we've got the system in the room. That always makes me very happy, because that's how we can think about how to design for these grand challenges. Great, so I've now got a question that I am going to pose to each of these wonderful people. I'm hoping that you're starting to get to grips with Slido, because as they're talking, if you have any questions, put them on Slido and then we'll get the screen up in a moment. But my first question is to you, Manuel. We've obviously heard in the introductions, and thank you for inspiring introductions. It was really great to get a sense of some of the issues that need to be navigated to answer the question behind us. So it's clear that decarbonisation of the maritime sector is really important, and biofuels may have some role in that. But from WWF's perspective, Manuel, what are the key issues emerging in the use of sustainable biofuels from different industries? Because obviously maritime sector is one of many industries that might be eyeing up the potential for biofuels.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again. So let me start by saying something. It's amazing, and probably we are not used to appreciating that we are now talking on a 2050 time. If you go back to the Paris Agreement doesn't include a clear 2050 target. And just 5 years after we signed or we agreed on the Paris Agreement, many sectors are defining clearly a net zero 2050 time. So something has happened. And for example, in this panel, different sectors, the port, the containers, etc., are talking about the emergency crisis. So we have really developed initiative and action to get to something that it had not been included in the Paris Agreement, and that is amazing. And that is something in which we should work on. And I am fully agree with Adair that what we do need is to define an ambitious target. If there are possibilities to go toward 100% reduction, and a real reduction, a net zero, as Adair has mentioned, not just to offsets, no, we should do that. So the IMO should raise ambition when they define their target. But let's talk about biofuels, Sally, and go to your question. So when we think about biofuels, or when we think about new technologies, there are different elements that we should consider. And also because human beings are used to forgetting lessons learned from the past. This is like the second boom of the biofuels. You remember the first one, and the first one, it was not related to climate.
It didn't go very well, did it?
Yeah, sure. And you remember when we stopped as a word with biofuels? I remember very well this news about Mexico. When the tortilla in Mexico grew in its prices. That was a big crisis in Mexico, no? Because the competition in between the biofuels and the food, and all what that meant in that time. So we know what does it mean to promote some kind of, this case, biomass source of energy. So when we think about this kind of new technology, the first thing that we should consider it is the direct and indirect impacts. Because when we think about biomass, for sure, it is a risky thing, because it is related strongly to deforestation. When we have just seen the IPCC land desertification and degradation report, that it is saying that we should produce more in a smaller places. So we should avoid to deforestate by promoting the biofuels. So that is a potential direct impact. But also there are some indirect impacts, the competition in between biomass with food, biomass with also ecosystem, among some others. So that is the first. The second one, when we think about biofuels and technologies and new technologies, it is strongly related to governance. For example, in the geoengineering sector, it is not that we are going to just say not to the science or not to the evolving process of the technology, but we do need to know how to manage the new technologies. And in this case, probably biofuels, it is more related to a transitional source of energy towards new technology, that it is more related to electrifying the sector. So when we promote this kind of transitional source of energy, what we do need to think it is, how can we continue pushing for the new, for what we are trying to achieve, that it is to electrify in the sector. Also, what we do need to have it is mechanism to track what it is happening. And in that sense, how strongly we can support our objective in science, it is key. I know that the shipping sector is talking with this Science-Based Target Initiative. I know that still the Science-Based Target Initiative, it is developing the targets. And they are talking on how could it could be possible to do that soon. I think that is an important step forward, because we do need to support this kind of decisions and targets strongly on science. But finally, what we do need to have it is a systemic vision. Because when we think about source of energy as biofuels, it is not just biofuels. Adair in some way has already mentioned. But if we don't go against subsidies to fossil fuels, to the traditional, or if we don't put incentive as carbon pricing or carbon taxes, it's going to be very difficult to promote this kind of technology in a sustainable way. By the end, I want to go back to the title. We are talking about sustainable biofuels. So we must give some content to that concept. What does it mean for you, friends, colleagues, that sustainable concept when we think about biofuels? Finally, and this is something that it is related to a panel that I had yesterday, I moderated yesterday, we are in a time in which the new actions of some sectors, as in this case, the shipping, should be transparent, credible, and accountable. That is the importance of the current time of the action agenda. Because in the beginning, we used to think, okay, let's convene all the actors and all the sectors together. Now we are scaling up the action agenda by this kind of strong action, but that should be transparent, credible, and accountable. And by the end, what we are seeking, it is to change behavior. And that is the idea of this kind of initiative and action.
Great, thank you very well, Manuel, and thank you for teeing up my question to Gerard, actually, which is, I'm really curious to understand more about your view on the potential for sustainable biofuels, and specifically can you tell us a bit about the availability of sustainable fuels and the certification surrounding that, and what would need to happen to make these sustainable fuels available to the shipping industry?
Sure, I'm going to start a little broader than that. If we think about what we want the world to look like, ideally tomorrow, but in 2050, we have a circular economy. So carbon is a fundamental part of our economy. We're going to need a lot of carbon, but we want a lot of that carbon being recycled and being reused. But because no system ever is perfectly efficient, we're going to have to continuously top off that carbon. So as we top off that carbon, we can do it through carbon capture. There's different types of carbon capture. Plants is an example of carbon capture. So one could imagine a situation where we are taking renewable carbon and feeding it into a recycle and reuse type engine that is driving human thriving. That brings up the issue then of living within global boundaries. And this is another way of phrasing the sustainability concern. Right now, obviously, we cross the global boundary annually, like in August or something, right? We're well past, we're not, none of us, the human race is not living within its means. So one solution is actually to grow the boundaries. So when you put up a solar panel, you're actually expanding the boundary of our energy system, right? So you're broadening that base that we can operate from. What we have seen in land use is we have seen in places like Asia, like Africa, like Brazil, a lot of destruction of land. There's a lot of marginal and degraded land that is an enormous opportunity to bring that land back in production so we can reclaim our planetary boundary. And all of that will require considerable investment. And that investment will require confidence, and that confidence, as Manuel pointed out, will come from accountability and transparency and understanding where that carbon came from. Was it good carbon? Was it useful carbon? So what we're seeing in the first wave of biofuel policies back in 2008, where they were generic. The pathways were nowhere near specific enough. But what we're seeing now is we have subsequently learned from that. So whether it's the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, UNIDO, FAO, IEA, IRENA, everybody has modeled and thought deeply about the potential for biomass to contribute to fuels. And the number that they tend to come up with is around 0.25% of residual liquid fuel use would come from biomass. So we're not asking for an infinite amount of biomass. We're not asking for 8 Earths worth. What we're saying is that from electrification and from energy efficiency, we are dropping our total liquid fuel use, and we are targeting that to the hard to abate sectors like aviation and maritime. So the question is, how do we achieve that accountability and that transparency? Well, we get away from generic categories of biodiesel. Instead, we transition to tracking, and we transition to a place like the state of California, where California set a goal of reducing the carbon intensity of transport in a linear way, and then has obligated parties, the entities that sell the fuel. And then what that does is that, and then so the obligated parties contribute money, and that money is then used to pay for technologies that accelerate the decarbonization. So what has this done? This has created a arms race amongst biofuel producers to get lower and lower carbon intensity, which is exactly what we want. So let's go all in on electrification. Let's go all in on energy efficiency, and for the residual. So in a sense, we've shrunk our demand on our globe, but then we're looking for opportunities to invest to bring more land into production. So we move past indirect land use change to what I call OLUC, or optimized land use change, where we bring back land in production, and the net result is increased forestation till the end of the century. And we can do that and produce more fuels at the same time.
So what you're really saying is that biofuels definitely have a role, but we need, and picking up Manuel's point earlier, we had a first wave of biofuels as a potential solution to rapid decarbonisation. We're now definitely in that second wave, but a real critical success factor for that second wave is to have that transparency and that accountability in terms of where the fuel has come from.
There was a huge transition.
Yeah.
So,
okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Just conscious that we have to go to Kirsi next, but thank you very much, Gerard. That was really, I think it was a really good way of understanding that point about traceability and a nice build from what Manuel had said. Kirsi, if I may, we've talked then already that there is a potential role for biofuels and that this goal of net carbon zero by 2050 is really important. I'd like to ask you, based upon your extensive experience in the maritime sector, what are the blocks that need to be in place for the shipping industry to kickstart this transition? So in other words, tell me more about those enablers. So we know we need to rapidly decarbonise. We've got a sense that these accountable, traceable biofuels might be part of that. What are the other levers in the system? What else needs to be in place if we're going to make that journey to 2050 to net carbon?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that all alternatives to fossil fuels have shortcomings. And there is no obvious fuel choice for the future. And therefore, I believe there will be a mix of fuels that will power the maritime industry in the future. Biofuel, I know that the others have already talked about it, but I think the one thing I'd like to add is that the benefit of biofuel is, with limitations, that it is considered a drop-in fuel. In other words, we could use, with some modifications, current technology and current infrastructure, so that's the plus for biofuels. However, there are these other limitations that the others have addressed, so I don't spend time on that. In terms of what are the blocks that we need to have in order to get to decarbonization in shipping, is we will need resources. It will cost a lot of money to develop the technologies and the fuels that we need. We need collaboration. The others have already referred to it. Shipping cannot do it alone. And we also need regulatory certainty. I almost forgot it. And it's probably one of the most important things that shipping needs. Shipping has been hurt very badly by regulatory uncertainty, which has created a mentality of wait and see, because the early adapters have been almost punished for adapting technologies early. So regulatory certainty is very, very important. And then lastly, there has to be, because there's a cost, there has to be an ability to transfer the increased cost of shipping to other stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I noticed on the slide there was a question around investments, and just picking that up and posing that to yourself. So you say that if we're going to make this transition, we need significant investment. Any sense of where that investment might come from?
So at the moment, there are various groups that some of them are represented here, and there are some pilots where that have some investments to investigate these different technologies and fuels. However, and then there was also discussion in the last MEPC at IMO to have a IMO administered fund where there would be a voluntary investment. I don't think we have a clear picture where the funds will be coming. There's of course a discussion about giving carbon a cost, also in shipping, which sometimes is referred to as a fuel tax. So I think this is a debate that still has to take place in the International Maritime Organization.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Christine, turning to someone that operates ports and aviation facilities, I'm curious to know what you see as a potential for biofuels and how might that potential differ between maritime and aviation? And kind of linked in with that, how, as the Port of New York, are you going to navigate this? So if you could just kind of give us your perspective from an operator and how you see the potential and how you see that playing through in terms of the facilities that you oversee.
Sure. I think the short answer is we don't yet know how exactly we're going to navigate it. But as Kirsi was saying, it really is a multi-stakeholder dialogue that needs to happen for us to get there. So I'm certainly not, in my role, I look to achieve deep decarbonization across all of our sectors with our partners. So I'm not an expert in the shipping industry or the aviation industry, but that being said, a couple of obvious things have manifested themselves in our stakeholder dialogue in terms of the viability of something like biofuels in an aviation application as compared to a shipping application, where jet fuel is a very highly refined product with very specific performance specifications, and it costs more. And so in terms of any sort of biofuel being cost competitive with an existing fossil fuel, aviation is probably a better target for having some of that, close to price parity. Whereas, I think on the flip side, in the shipping industry, the engines can pretty much burn anything. At least that's my understanding. I defer to my shipping experts on the panel up here to really validate that. But that one would think would then drive down the cost of needing to produce a very specific product. But without the right policy regime, neither scenario is going to work anyway. And so obviously, globally, there are different policies that have been put into place in different jurisdictions, whether it's municipal, state, national. But the challenge with shipping is a lot of the emissions aren't in anyone's jurisdiction. And so that's where bodies like the IMO are going to be really important in establishing some sort of a value for a carbon, because in the aviation industry we have seen at least some attempts at that, even if many find CORSIA, so I'm gonna get the exact acronym wrong, but it's the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation or something along those lines. But that being said, there is at least some attempt at putting a cost to the carbon that's emitted in the aviation sector that can potentially provide some price support for some of these alternative fuels. But we're not necessarily seeing that on the maritime side. And so, from the perspective of a port authority, when we're engaging our stakeholders, we've had a lot more of a working dialogue on the aviation side because of some of these things that are already happening in the industry. Whereas on the shipping side, we're a little bit further removed from that. We are a landlord port authority. We have marine terminal operators that then are managing the port facilities, and then the ocean-going vessels are really the ones that are producing the emissions. So our ability to really influence that behavior is a little bit more muted. But that being said, I think Gerard was saying there needs to be sort of the demand needs to be created in multiple different ways. The beneficial cargo owners need to ask for their supply chain to be greened. The end users, the consumers, need to be asking for that supply chain to be greened. And then you need some of this policy support in the form potentially of a low carbon fuel standard similar to what's happening in California. But a low carbon fuel standard on its own, I don't think is sufficient. The boundaries are going to be pretty confined, and it could send biofuel to the least cost use, which is not where we want it. We want all of that electrification to happen. We want all of those sectors that are easy to decarbonize to find some of those other technologies. And that's where I think there needs to be some corresponding policy direction to get biofuels into either the shipping or the aviation sectors. And at least in in our region, there is some discussion about a transportation climate initiative, which is essentially a cap and invest program that can take some of the proceeds from a penalty on transportation related carbon and put that money in the hands of state entities that can then make direct investments in some of the infrastructure that's going to be required to support the transition to low carbon fuels. So even if a low carbon fuel standard is helping to achieve price parity with the fuels, if all of the fueling infrastructure needs to be built, there's a huge investment that's needed there. And where are those dollars coming from? To have some sort of a cap and invest program where you could target some of those investments and alleviate that infrastructure cost. I think that you're really going to need to see those two policies working together.
Great. So even though the short answer kind of to the future potential biofuels is we don't really know, there are lots of bits of the jigsaw beginning to come together, which is incredibly helpful. So Adair, looking to that transition then that we need to see over the next three decades, from your perspective, what are the options leading to zero emission shipping with sustainability as a driver? And could you speak a little bit to the economics of that as well in 3 minutes?
Okay, well, right, I'll talk about the options. I also wanted to talk about who will pay for the shipping industry. Look, there is a potential role for electric, battery ships, hydrogen ships, fuel cells, but I think it is primarily at the shorter distance, the riverine, the port areas, because when you work out the weight of a battery required to go from Pearl River Delta to Rotterdam, it doesn't work at the moment unless somebody has some incredible technological breakthrough. And hydrogen, of course, is a fantastic fuel in terms of a gravimetric density, packs a hell of a lot of a kilowatts into a kilogram, but in volumetric, it's a big problem and it would displace cargo. So we think that the two main likely options for long-distance international shipping are biofuels and ammonia. Ammonia, which can be made zero carbon if you make the hydrogen from zero carbon fashion, which you can undoubtedly do if you have renewable electricity and you electrolyze your hydrogen. So let's think about the relative merits of those two routes. Here's a set of reasons why, in the long run, the ammonia route might win out. The fundamental thing is, how do we get more energy in a clean fashion? Ultimately, up there, the sun shines down on the world every day, 8,000 times as much energy as we require to run the entire human, industrial, and economic and residential heat system. So how do we capture it? Well, the simple factor is you could capture it on biofuels on photosynthesis, or you could capture it on solar panels, and solar panels are about 100 times more efficient per hectare at capturing energy than photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is not a terribly efficient process. So the sheer hectares of land you'll have to take up if you do it by biofuels are bound to be bigger. And ultimately, electricity is going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and when it's cheaper enough, then the ammonia route might win out. On the other hand, the ammonia route is a much more complicated transition. I think it's the case, John would know much more than me, that in the engines, the changeover is not too complicated. We're hearing from Wärtsilä and MAN that they can change over those relatively straightforwardly. But there's an entire extra fuel handling process and fuel storage process, both in the ships and in the ports, which is different from the fossil fuel route. Whereas the biofuel route, if we can essentially create the precise chemical equivalent of existing heavy fuel oil, the existing fuel handling processes, both in the port and in the ship, are unchanged. It really is a drop in fuel. And so we're going to get this very difficult challenge to which way do we go? Do we go by a route which may be the better, cheaper route in the long term, or is this an easier transition? Now, the other crucial thing to say on biofuels is that clearly, and it's been mentioned several times already, the sustainability issue is fundamental. One of the most difficult things we found in the Energy Transition Commission was to get an agreement on how much sustainable biofuels we might be able to produce in the world. You can find estimates out there in the literature all the way from 30 exajoules to 250 exajoules. We had one member of the Commission who know a lot about this, the World Resources Institute, who are very, very wary about the sustainable supply of biofuels. They would say no more than 50 exajoules available on that basis. We played around with a figure at about 70 exajoules, 100 exajoules. If you had 70 exajoules or 100 exajoules, where would you put it? Would you put it in shipping? Would you put it in aviation? Would you put it in plastics? Would you do the last 5% of your power system with biomass in order to have a thermal dispatchable plant that can balance the system? I think our point of view is that we probably place a higher priority on aviation than shipping, because there don't seem to be an ammonia type alternative, though there are synthetic ways to make a jet fuel, a liquid hydrocarbon. But I think it's not impossible that there might be a reasonable claim from shipping on that biofuel resource. Certainly would place it much higher than the road transport area, where we fundamentally think that quite soon we should stop using biofuels in the road transport area because we have a better alternative, which is electrification. So those are, to me, some of the challenges that we have to think through in terms of this big choice between biofuels and ammonia. Final point on the economics. The economics of both of those routes might add very significantly to fuel costs and therefore voyage costs. But don't worry about that, because when you run that through to what the cost impact is on the end consumer, it is trivial. Even if total voyage costs went up 100%, the extra cost on a pair of jeans made in Bangladesh and sold here in New York will be less than 1%. Shipping is not a large enough part of the end consumer cost for it to be a problem. So who should pay? The consumer should pay. And actually we should be blunt about that. This may require higher freight rates, and as long as everybody is moving in the same direction, and this is the international coordination problem, we should end up with higher freight rates and a slightly higher consumer charge if that is required, and I think it probably will be required, whether we're going the ammonia route or the biofuel route.
Great. Thank you for laying out those options so clearly for us there, Adair. So, John, turning to someone that is operating these ships, Maersk, obviously a big brand in that respect. And given your moonshot goal that you talked about earlier, what is your current analysis of the role of biofuels in delivering that goal for 2050? And are there any risks and opportunities that haven't yet made their way out in the previous interventions?
Well, yeah, no, they're not completely new things. I think they're covered, but I think our perspective is slightly different because from where we sit, we do worry about the cost, for example. The ability of the shipping sector to generate margins that are sustainable for the business is notoriously very bad. It's, together with aviation, the worst performing industries over history of all sectors. So we do have a problem around the pricing. So before I just go into that, I think one of the biggest worries for us is that if we don't get the legislative support that we need, because the situation is that we're looking at it. Probably shipping, as I think was mentioned before, is much worse off than aviation. You're much closer to the right price point in aviation. In shipping, we're looking at 2 to 3 times the cost. And yes, you can work to make the good new stuff cheaper, and you should, and we will get it cheaper, I think, when we start to dedicate ourselves and our money and our collective brains in the ecosystem to make it cheaper. It will be cheaper, but we won't eliminate a gap of 200% to 300%. And so that's a conversation that needs to be had, and that's going to be a difficult conversation for shipping. So ammonia, the hydrogen route, is definitely on our table as something we're looking at. Various biofuel-related routes as well. I can add one perspective that is in favor of biofuel seen from our point of view, and it is the fact that I fully take the argument that this might be the best even from a natural science point of view or a physics point of view solution, ammonia in the long run. But we need to get to the station out there, and we need to do that through steps that are commercially viable. And obviously, bio-based solutions have this enormous potential that we can start to move the market already today, and we have done so. We've sold the first carbon neutral containers through a track and account for system to Hennes & Mauritz, and based on used cooking oil, which is of course not scalable in itself. But and we hear reactions, but you can't solve it with cooking oil. No, but that's not the point. The point is that for the first time in the history of container shipping, has someone paid a price premium for a greener product, and these are the steps that are needed. And the hydrogen way does not offer this possibility for us. It's like you need to get everything in place, and then you shift, and then you're there. And so one of the questions that we are posing ourselves also, is there a way back to the hydrogen way later? Because that would be optimal seen from a commercial point of view, because we need to get the money flowing. Yeah.
Okay, great. My goodness, that was a tour de force of the issues that are relevant to the big question on the screen behind us. I'm going to go to Slido in a moment, but I just want to put you all on notice, if I may, for, in a sentence, your key message for the SSI in relation to this question about the role of sustainable biofuels in shipping decarbonisation, that the SSI then can then take to the final synthesis of everything they've learned through this inquiry to the event in November. So I'm going to come back to you all in a moment for your one key message, one sentence, please. And actually, I realise I can't see the screen, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of movement. Ooh. So current state of biofuels, I think we've covered that. Who will pay? We've covered that. There's no clear answer. Can we just look at this question that's number 3? So what is the potential for biofuels with carbon capture and sequestration in shipping? Who would like to take that?
Well, it depends what it means.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not clear.
The answer is it's actually quite difficult to apply carbon capture and sequestration in a decentralized use environment, which is why, whether in aviation or trucking or shipping, people broadly speaking don't think that there are carbon capture and sequestration options, because you've got so many units, unlike in a cement plant, a power plant, etc. Now, it may be possible, and I don't know whether this John would know, that we could downscale carbon capture and storage, so we might be able to do it in an individual large ship. But I would say at the moment that whereas if we were talking about cement or steel or petrochemicals, we would absolutely be talking about carbon capture and storage as core technologies. I think at the moment we think it's rather peripheral.
Okay, Kirsi, you wanted to come in.
Right, so I am aware of a couple of technologies that are being looked at, not specifically biofuels, but doing carbon capture on board the vessels. So there are a couple of research projects going on. However, my personal view is that we should try to keep more equipment put on the ships, away from the ships, and whatever carbon capture takes place, it should happen on shore.
Okay, great, thank you. So going back to Slido then, there's a question there around how do you see the architecture, engineering, construction, sorry, this is not brilliant. I have to go closer. I don't have my magnifying glasses. How do you see the architecture, engineering and construction industry being most, oh that's complicated, let's not do that one. I'm much more interested in who are the key decision makers in the transition to sustainable shipping? That's a really nice question. Who'd like to have a go at that one? Kirsi?
So the Paris Agreement left the authority to regulate carbon emissions from shipping to the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. And given that shipping is international, the IMO is the right forum to regulate shipping, in short.
Okay, that's quite clear. Lots of consensus.
Can I ask how then does that, so that's the IMO, that's the big conference, how then is that distributed down in practice? What is the linkage between the IMO and the ship operations?
So IMO members governments.
The governments, right.
So, and then the governments become signatories to the regulations, and they implement the regulations into their laws. And then we have a system of flag states, port states that basically enforce these laws.
So it's like if a ship is flagged, is that the nationality that's responsible for that ship's emissions, or how does that work?
So first of all, the flag state has a responsibility for making sure that the vessel is compliant with all the regulations. But then we have port states that when the ship comes to port, inspect the records, inspect the equipment, and then there's also definitely a role by the classification societies, because to be able to operate internationally, your vessel has to be part of one of the class societies. So it's multiple.
I mean, I think this would be a very interesting issue for your study, because this question of how does the IMO vision end up impacting it? You know, IMO clearly has the ability, and it's a very powerful ability, to regulate what a ship has to look like and how efficient it has to be. Fantastic thing to do. But as John said earlier, however efficient we got to go, we've then got to change the fuel in some way. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we wanted to go the biofuel route, right? And we knew that. And by 2050, we wanted to be 100% biofuel. I think thinking through, and suppose the IMO said our target is not 50%, it's 100%. I think thinking through, how does that actually operationalize, right? Does the IMO have the ability to say to all the port members, you must be at 25%, biofuel supply by 2030, 75% by 2050? And do we have the architecture to achieve that degree? Because the alternative, of course, is to go a taxation route. But can we go a taxation route where you just tax the fossil fuels at a high enough price that everybody will switch in any case? But when we look at both the aviation industry and the shipping industry, they do have the great advantage of these international UN regulators, IMO and ICAO. And in the shipping industry, that's incredibly useful because it offsets the disadvantage of parts of the shipping industry, which is the multiplicity of relationships between owners and charterers and operators that actually sometimes makes it quite difficult. But I think more thinking has got to be done about, suppose biofuels is always more expensive than fossil fuels, so it's not just going to win immediately. Have we got the architecture to either have a clear fuel mandate or a clear price that takes us from A to B? I suspect we have, but I think we need more work on how it would actually operate.
Great.
If it's outcome-based and then it's fuel agnostic, then theoretically, if you just set the targets and the dates, then the market should help inform which fuel is most appropriate. But the lead time needs to be long enough that then the vessels are constructed to be able to accept that fuel, and then port operators like my organization can put the fueling infrastructure in place. So the time really is now.
But can I just check, Christine, the point earlier? Are we all agreed that if it was a biofuel route, you don't actually have to invest in new infrastructure? If it's biofuel, broadly speaking?
But to get to net zero, I think we seem to have agreed that the scale isn't there.
Okay,
to
so
go
that
biofuel.
we're going to use some other things which will require
Exactly.
refueling.
So biofuels is part of the pathway, but not the sole answer.
Okay.
John, you've been desperate to come in.
No, I'm not desperate.
Well, not
at all.
desperate, but you were keen.
Not yet, at least. We might be in a couple of years' time. But
You were keen.
no, I just want. I mean, I think IMO, of course, is crucial here, but. And then we talk about a lot of actors that need to move, but I do think it's possible to single out 4 type of actors that are the most important decision makers, because this is an industrialization process, and in a situation where we know that the product for a very long time will not be in itself price competitive with what we have today. So therefore, the regulators are there, and preferably global, because shipping is global industry. But then I think the three other main actors here, decision makers, are the ship owners, because the ship owners need to send the signal to the other main actor, which is the energy providers, that they want to buy something that they figure out. And then I would point to the in general the finance sector, different types of financiers, because you do need venture capital in this process, and you probably need blended finance solutions. You need to look at de-risking tools and so on from in the financing of this. And then of course there are engine manufacturers, there are ports, there are shipyards and so on, but I do think they're second tier.
Yeah.
The key decision makers are the ship owners, just to wrap up, that they want this, the energy companies, that they want to deliver it, that there's someone that want to finance it, and there are regulators that want to support it from a regulatory point of view. That's the four key actors.
Yeah, and they need to come together as a coordinated system.
Yeah.
Manuel?
Very short. I'm not sure who is the anonymous, but this question could be the next panel, because the concept of decision makers, it is hiding a lot of different elements. First, when we talk about climate, and you mentioned the IMO representing an international productive activity or sector, so what it is behind it is many governmental bodies in different places, not necessarily coordinating in between. So we have governmental bodies negotiating in the COPs, in the IMO, in the renewable energy sector, IRENA, among many others. So there is a governance problem, global and domestic, that it is the lack of coordination. But after that, the point it is, how can we connect those decisions into their constituencies? That in case of a government in a COP, it is the citizens. But in case of the IMO, it is the different pieces of the shipping sector. So that kind of discussion, I see that we do need to.
And it's happening in all sorts of different sectors. I'm mindful of time, and that I do want to ask each of you for your key message for Andrew to take into the final stages of this inquiry to present to the IMO in November. Then I'm going to somehow try and summarise our discussion, which I'm thinking about that still. And I'm going to hand back to Andrew, because we said we would finish at 11, and I know how busy Climate Week is. And I should have said earlier, thank you for making the effort to come downtown, because everything is happening in Midtown, and it's actually, for me, it was lovely to see some fresh air and some light, actually. Yes. So this is a wonderful venue, having spent 3 days in a box, basically.
Post-apocalyptic
so I digress.
This is nice.
For each of you then, your key message for the SSI to feed into this inquiry, which is asking this question: what is the role of sustainable biofuels in shipping's decarbonisation? Manuel, your key message.
Keep the vision and give a strong content to the sustainable world for the biofuels.
Great,
give
thank you.
Content to that.
Gerald.
SSI can let the broader community know that biofuels can play a responsible role, and that they should catalyze the dialogue between the ag and energy communities to make that happen.
Great. Kirsi?
We need to buy time for what's needed for the development of whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, fuel cells, you name it. And therefore, we need to focus on what's available today. And in terms of the fuels, what's available today is biofuels, LNG, LPG. And we have available energy efficiency measures and operational measures. And we should seriously think about a period of mandated slow steaming that could buy some time for us.
Great, thank you.
Specific to biofuels, the IMO needs to consider a carbon pricing scheme similar to Corsia, hopefully with more ambitious and stringent requirements, just to attract that biofuel to the shipping sector.
Thank you very much. Adair?
Well, two ones. One, the sustainability criteria are absolutely essential. because if each single sector of the economy says, I'd like some biofuels, and we just let that to occur, we will do terrible things to the natural environment. So the clear sustainability criteria are crucial. And secondly, I think the crucial analytical issue, which I know John and Maersk are working on, is this issue of, could we do a transition? If we go down the biofuel route, can we do it in a route that then makes it easier at the appropriate time to move to probably an ammonia route or some variant of a hydrogen route? Or have we got one of those really difficult problems about what we want to do in the short term versus what we want to do in the long term? I don't know the answer to that, but presumably if we're really clever about the engineering, we can make that transition possible. And I think that would be a good thing to be as part of our vision of what we want to achieve.
Great, thank you. John?
I have to first react to the slow steaming point, which I think is a very dangerous thing to do. And just 2 words: mandatory slow steaming will reward inefficient tonnage in the market, and that's not the way to go. Now, that's not to say that there are not ways to achieve the reductions in the short term. You just have to regulate power, the shaft power, instead of the speed, because then you allow the efficient vessels to sail faster, and that's a great incentive to reward the efficient vessels. So it's just a very important point, because it's floating around out there, and it would be disastrous to go down regulating speed. You need to regulate power. And there are technicalities, we don't have time for that, but that's just a point I have.
You do slow steam if you regulate power.
Yes, but you regulate on the basis of the power, and it's the same. You can get the same result on CO2 emissions, but you get a different incentive structure out of it, and that's really, really important. Then, and I'll come to biofuel, but it's just the offsetting question. So our target is also without offsetting, and fully concur with the viewpoint that in the long run there are no offsets to buy. The other problem with that is that you get money floating away from innovation. But I do think, and that might be a question also to Andrew, I mean, one of the biggest logistic companies in the world just announced a massive offsetting package to be able to sell carbon neutral transport based on nature conservation and other stuff. And you know, that's the risk that I think is worth considering for a future whatever report and panel is. How do we avoid that big offsetting schemes to make people feel good in the short term that you can buy something that's neutral is diverting all the efforts away from the innovation that we need? So that's one question. Then on the biofuel question, I actually wanted to turn to Gerard's point from the beginning about expanding, because I think there's a lot of work that has to be done yet still on availability question, but within a much less dogmatic point of view than the most of what I've seen, and applying the same mindset of innovation that we do in all other technological areas in the world, and where we see breakthroughs that we wouldn't have imagined. I do not have the answers, but I can't believe that in the connection to biocapacity, all of a sudden, as humanity, we would not be able to make major breakthroughs with innovation. It should be strange. It would be the only area where we can't do that. So, and that's probably my key point for Andrew, is to look into that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Just by way of information, we'll be here till 11:30, so if the panellists don't have to rush off, which given that it's Climate Week, you probably do, if there are further questions, then try and grab them before they leave. I mean, I think what I took from that conversation, first of all, I would just like to reflect, Manuel, your very first point, which is I'm actually heartened that we're having this conversation, that we've moved from the theory and the aspiration to actually practically, how are we going to decarbonise shipping? So I think that is something a small celebration in this week of difficult news. But in terms of the answer to this specific question, the role of sustainable biofuels in decarbonisation, I think 3 things really strike me. You can't answer this question in isolation, and that was really your last point, John. We absolutely need to ask this question within the context of what other sectors are doing, and that kind of broader system within which shipping operates and within which that decarbonisation target is delivered. Which brings me to the second point, and again, and while I'm stealing from you here, you talked about the need for a systemic vision. And in a way, as we've been looking at bits of the jigsaw this morning, it seems to me that perhaps there isn't a clear enough sense about what that vision is for that radical decarbonisation pathways for shipping, because that systemic vision would allow you to make the connections between all of the different issues, land use and so forth, but also to helicopter up from, do we have traceability on this biofuel, to actually, is this the best use of the biofuel in terms of that broader societal and economic ambition for decarbonisation. And clearly the conversation has also focused on the key enablers, of which there are many. We have all these bits of the jigsaw, but quite how they come together is not completely clear. And I think I picked out 3 sets of enablers in your discussion. The first is policy. We all know from experience in multiple sectors, policy incoherence, policy uncertainty slows progress. So there is a need for the IMO, I imagine, to have a very strong voice in terms of certainty around policy and understanding what that policy framework might look like. The second enabler, I think, is innovation. We need to ensure there is room in understanding the answer to this question for innovation to come in. It's not specific to shipping, but it's something I think that we sometimes forget about, perhaps. But then I think the third biggest enabler, and came through in very different strands of the conversation, is the economics. And if we look at the decarbonisation pathways for all sectors right now, one of the key questions is, what is the economic model that's going to support that? And at the moment, the goals of the current economic model are not sustainable development. We need systems change, so the goal of the current economic model is sustainable development. And so that third set of enablers is the whole economics piece, and John, you talked about that very eloquently. So I don't think we've got a one-sentence answer to the question that we were trying to ask. It's complicated, it's uncertain, but I do think this conversation has helped us shine a light on how do we approach our answer to this question by taking that systems view, and how do we pull together the bits that we know are already part of the solution in a way that gets us that rapid decarbonisation. And I suppose the short answer to the question is, there is a role, but quite what that looks like yet, we still need to work that through. So thank you very much, panellists. That was a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sally. Well, Sally summed that up very well. I think this is a very complex issue. We've dared through 2019 to explore with many stakeholders all the different views and aspects, and particularly around the system issues. Wish this great panel, thank you very much for giving up your time and constructively committing to various views which will help us compile our findings through this part of the journey. Thank you also, Sally, for moderating. It's a challenging subject to moderate, and lots of different inputs and views brought to the table. In terms of practicalities, as Sally mentioned, we're here through till 11:30. Some of the panelists may still have time to mingle and discuss with you. There are fresh refreshments and some snacks outside, so please join us. If you have to rush off, we understand. This is a very busy week for all. And just to remind you that our event will be leading into the findings that we'll put in the report, which we'll publish on November the 15th, and that'll be available from the end of that day on our website. When you leave, can you please return to the registration desk all these? These will be recycled. And thank you for all your contributions on Slido. It's a different concept to put it sort of anonymously and in text, but very useful. And thank you again, everybody, for contributing to SSI's work here. Thank you.